Okay, so to get a job in software, we have to study leak code, we have to do system design, we have to build projects, we have to do object-oriented design, we have to do take-home projects. Like, which one should we be focusing on? Today, I wanted to give you a simple flowchart of what you should focus on given how much time you have for your software job. And today's video specifically is going to focus on people with 0 years of experience in the software industry, because that's the situation I was in when I started my first journey. This is my flowchart, and let's start with at the top of it. The most important question to ask is, are you getting interviews? Which is probably the most frustrating part of this whole process for some people. Let's say you're not getting interviews. So how do we gauge that we're not getting interviews, or we're just not waiting long enough for these responses from companies to come back? I would say, as a general rule of thumb, if you've been applying for jobs every single day, but you haven't gotten a single response in over a month, it probably means it's time to change something up. So you should probably be doing a few things. The first is to take a look at your resume. When I came out of college, this was my resume, and it was absolute garbage. But over time, I was able to shift things around and finally make it into something that was, somewhat presentable. One thing I would strongly recommend is to go to r/engineering resumes and look at the sidebar and read all the information that's contained in there. If you're interested in a deep dive into what is going on in the sidebar, I'll probably go through that in a future video. But for now, here are probably the main tips and takeaways that you can take away in like 5 seconds. Basically, for every point on your resume, you want to quantify it with something like the XYZ format or the star format. Basically, you accomplished X by the measure Y, resulting in Z. And that should be every single bullet point. You should list all of your skills at the top, followed by your work experience, followed by any projects you have, followed by your education. Make sure your formatting is good and it's not confusing and it's readable, and make sure the entire resume can be filled up with some kind of information. Because again, if you look at my first resume, it was sad. It was like half a page. And if you look at the points on my resume, they didn't make any sense, right? They didn't tell you like what I actually did or what I actually did that made an actionable impact on the companies that I was working for. So now the second question you might ask is, well, I don't have enough work experience. Like, what am I supposed to put on my resume to make it less blank? This is where the side projects come in. And this is talked about all the time online, where if you can't get interviews, do side projects. That is crucial. And I agree with that statement. But this is almost more of a sub point that I didn't put into this flowchart, which is that when I was a new grad, when I had 0 years of experience, I was like, what do I possibly work on? So if you're self-driven enough that you know what to work on, then just go ahead and implement that. Whatever it is, cloning Reddit, cloning Twitter, making some sort of AI application, stuff like that, like pulling from the ChatGPT API, all that stuff is good for a side project. But if you don't know what to do, what I recommend is to go to the site Kaggle. Kaggle is basically like a site of free datasets online for everything you can possibly think of. Take anything that you could possibly be interested in. Take any type of hobby you have. Say you watch basketball, you watch the NBA, right? Download some NBA stats, put it into a database, and serve it in a web application, and that can be your side project. If you don't have that much experience, most people during interviews are going to be talking about your projects, and they're going to be seeing like, are you bullshitting you doing this project? Did you just make some shit up or copy some shit off of someone else on GitHub? So it is important to find a project that you're passionate about. Okay, so back to the flowchart. If you are getting interviews, what type of company are you trying to apply for? The big question is, are you shooting for FANG level companies? If you are not, this is important. You don't need to grind a ton of lead code questions, but you do need to grind basic string manipulation questions and basic array type questions for coding interviews. The reason being is that when I was coming out of college and interviewing for a lot of places, they didn't necessarily ask me like complicated lead code questions. Like I wasn't balancing trees or traversing through graphs or doing dynamic programming, stuff like that. But I was asked stuff like, reverse a string or do some string manipulation, remove like every third letter in a string or something like that. And these are pretty easy questions, but they can get progressively harder if you haven't really practiced them. So string manipulation questions and array questions are very commonly asked by companies that are just trying to assess, okay, can you code and did you pass like a CS 103 class or something? What I recommend here is to go to the NeetCode 150 and just do the first few sections. The first few sections about arrays, about hash maps, about binary search, about using multiple pointers. These are things that will actually be asked all the time for companies that aren't FANG level interviews, and they will serve you well if you understand them. And especially if you understand how to use the tools that he's teaching in NeetCode. So back to the original topic. Are you shooting for FANG level companies? If you are shooting for FANG level companies, then ask yourself, are you pressed for time? If you are not pressed for time, well, that's where all the unhelpful information comes back in, which is you want to do a little bit of everything, right? You want to understand LeetCode, you want to work on side projects to get these interviews, you want to continue to be coding in your own time. So this is the part where it's like, yeah, you have to do all of the above. But I would say if you have a lot of time, the basic thing you want to do is go through the NeetCode 150 in full. And then after that point, just practice some questions that are important to you or that you think you struggle with and continue on your path there. And so moving on to the other side, if you are pressed for time, say you got an interview at Meta or something and you haven't practiced at all and the interview is in 2 weeks. Well, what are your options here? If you are going for FANG, and you are pressed for time, you're kind of screwed. So you might want to try to push that interview out a little bit. But if you cannot, this is where LeetCode Premium comes into play. And if you go online, everyone in the world uses LeetCode Premium. This is basically a paid service that LeetCode provides that basically where you can see what LeetCode questions do companies ask and how frequently do they ask them. And everyone in the industry uses this list to study for company interviews. If you do not use this list, you are at a disadvantage. What you want to do is basically, if it's a big enough company, they're going to have questions tagged in here. You want to go to your company that you're interviewing for and you want to sort the frequency of the question being asked or the recency of the question being asked to the past 6 months. And then do as many of those questions or all of those questions if you can. For certain companies, they'll literally just ask you questions from those lists. But even if they don't ask you questions from those lists, you get a sense of what kinds of questions these companies like to ask, right? Like certain companies don't ask dynamic programming, but Google is notorious for asking tons and tons of dynamic programming questions, which is very apparent in the list of questions on LeetCode Premium that are sorted by Google, because a whole bunch of those questions are really complicated dynamic programming questions. So if you're pressed for time, doing those questions will help you at least get a sense of what the company asks, and then just sit there and hope that you get something similar. And that's pretty much it. This is the flowchart that you should use to focus your time given what stage of your software job search that you're on. And hopefully this helped to relieve some stress overall. And one last thing that I always want to say is that the job search is highly luck-based. Some days you're just going to feel super off. You're going to get every question wrong. You're going to make the stupidest mistakes. And some days you're just going to be on it. Like you're going to get everything right. Everything is going your way and it's going to be perfect. It's just about waiting for those moments to come by and giving ourselves the opportunity to get lucky in our interviews. Anyways, that's it for me today. Check out this video if you want to watch a video about how to properly track your job applications for software, because I guarantee you it's important to do it right. But yeah, as always, thanks for watching.